20 doctors couldn't save her. A brave cop fighting for her life. Every second that ticked by pushed her closer to death. But then, in the shadows, someone nobody expected, someone the world had already written off, saw what everyone else missed. One man's courage would become the difference between life and death. What he noticed next would shock everyone. Emily's life hung by a thread. 20 doctors worked frantically, their hands moving in a blur, but nothing seemed to make a difference. Machines beeped, monitors flashed, and yet the woman in the uniform, the brave cop who had risked everything to protect others, was slipping further from life. Minutes felt like hours. Every second carried the weight of a lifetime. Dr. Lauren barked orders, her voice sharp, her confidence unshaken, but even she couldn't see what was coming. What crucial detail was hidden in plain sight? Outside the chaos of the ER, in a place no one expected, Isaiah watched silently. A man society had labeled dangerous, a prisoner chained by his past. But in that moment, he saw something no one else did. Something small, almost invisible, yet deadly. Could one overlooked sign really hold the key to saving Emily? Could someone society had already given up on actually make the difference between life and death? As the tension in the room reached a breaking point, Isaiah had to decide, intervene and risk everything, or stay silent and let history repeat itself. What he noticed next would shock everyone and change the course of Emily's life forever. Emily had always been the first to arrive and the last to leave. In the quiet hours of the morning, before the city stirred, she patrolled streets where most people feared to tread. Her colleagues knew her as reliable, sharp, and fearless. But off-duty, she was just Emily, a daughter who called home every Sunday, a friend who remembered birthdays, a woman who loved simple things, a cup of coffee at sunrise, a dog wagging its tail in her apartment. Life felt balanced, predictable, safe. Isaiah's world was starkly different, yet shaped by rules and routines of its own. Inside the prison walls, he moved silently through narrow hallways and crowded cells, navigating unspoken codes and constant scrutiny. He read, trained, and observed, his mind sharp, his instincts sharper. In a place where most overlooked him, Isaiah had learned to see everything. His life outside these walls had been rough, unfairly judged and unfairly limited, but inside, he had carved his own space of order and control. In the city around them, tension simmered just below the surface. Emily's badge sometimes made strangers trust her too quickly, but it also painted her as other in certain neighborhoods. Isaiah, in turn, had long known the sting of assumptions, the glances that said he didn't belong, the whispered judgments before words were ever exchanged. It started small. Emily noticed sideways looks while responding to calls in parts of the city where trust was scarce. She chalked it up to nerves and routine skepticism, but something in the air hinted that respect alone wouldn't shield her forever. For Isaiah, it was the routine prejudices of guards and fellow inmates, the invisible lines drawn before anyone spoke to him. He understood these invisible forces all too well. They shaped every choice, every second, every opportunity to act. Life still carried a rhythm, but the cracks were forming. Emily didn't yet know that her courage would soon be tested, not just by the dangers of her job, but by an injustice so blatant, so avoidable, that it would push everyone around her to their limits. Isaiah didn't yet know he would become the unlikely key to saving a life that the world seemed willing to write off. In the calm before the storm, both lived in parallel worlds defined by rules, loyalty, and duty. But the collision of those worlds was coming, and no one would be able to ignore the biases, the misjudgments, and the cruelty waiting just around the corner. Emily's mornings used to start with the calm hum of the city waking up. Now every call felt heavier, every glance sharper. At first it was subtle, a smirk when she approached, a muttered comment when she walked past. Then it escalated. Citizens she once helped without question now questioned her authority, their words dripping with distrust that had nothing to do with her job. At a routine traffic stop, a man refused to follow instructions. "Who do you think you are?" he spat, his eyes narrowing, not because she was a cop, but because she was a woman. And not just any woman, but a white cop whose presence seemed to spark a mix of resentment and defiance. Emily felt the sting, the unspoken judgment of a society ready to doubt her at every turn. She reminded herself to stay professional, to not let anger or frustration cloud her judgment. But inside, something had begun to simmer. Back at the precinct, the tension didn't ease. Colleagues who once shared stories over coffee now avoided eye contact, whispering about political correctness or being careful. Emily could feel the isolation creeping in, subtle yet suffocating. Even Dr. Lauren, called to consult on cases, started dismissing some of her concerns, not maliciously, but through the haze of overworked routines and systemic blind spots. Mistakes were overlooked when Emily raised red flags, while others' errors were amplified. Meanwhile, Isaiah moved through the prison with his usual vigilance. He had learned to read people, to detect when their intentions were honest, and when they hid prejudice behind routines. The staff treated him differently depending on the day, the mood, or the news cycle. He had seen it before. Someone overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Not because they lacked skill or knowledge, but because the system had decided their worth. And then it happened. Emily was called to respond to a medical emergency at a local community center. A young man had collapsed and paramedics were struggling to stabilize him. Emily rushed in, adrenaline fueling every step. But as she arrived, she was met with resistance, not from the patient, but from the crowd, from whispers that her presence wasn't wanted. Eyes followed her every move, some filled with suspicion, some with disdain. Every instruction she gave was questioned, every action second-guessed. Inside the crowded room, Emily noticed Dr. Lauren arriving with her team. They began working frantically, but there was a tension in the air. Orders were given, but subtle hesitation slowed the response. A vital symptom went unnoticed. Monitors beeped warnings that nobody reacted to fast enough. Emily felt her stomach knot with frustration, powerless against both the chaos and the invisible weight of bias that clouded judgment. Isaiah, watching through the security monitor from the prison's connected observation system, noticed the missed detail immediately. Something in Emily's vitals, subtle yet critical, screamed for attention. But he knew that speaking up meant crossing invisible lines, lines society had drawn to keep people like him silent. And yet, the instinct to act, to prevent tragedy, burned stronger. The tension mounted with every passing second. Emily, unaware of Isaiah's observation, continued to struggle against both the medical chaos and the quiet prejudice that slowed even the most urgent interventions. Each doctor's oversight, each delayed movement, stacked like bricks on her chest, threatening to crush the life she had fought to protect. And then, just as the monitors flatlined, Isaiah made a decision.
He had to act.
But how could a prisoner, chained by circumstance and judged by society, reach across walls and systems to save a life everyone else had overlooked? The room seemed to freeze. The seconds stretched. Would anyone notice the one detail Isaiah had spotted? Or would Emily's life slip through the cracks of oversight and bias? The room was chaos incarnate. Monitors beeped frantically, alarms pierced the air, and every second felt like an eternity. Emily's hands shook as she tried to maintain control. But exhaustion and frustration clawed at her. Dr. Lauren's team moved with precision, yet something critical had been overlooked, a detail that could no longer wait. Emily's voice rose above the clamor, but it was drowned out by both human error and the invisible weight of doubt that had surrounded her since she walked into this room. Isaiah watched everything unfold through the security feed, his eyes narrowing at the unmistakable sign, a subtle irregularity in Emily's vitals that everyone else had missed. His pulse quickened. This was the moment that could mean life or death. The prisoner inside him, the man society had dismissed, surged with a determination no one expected. But he couldn't just shout through the intercom. His voice would be ignored, dismissed, labeled as interference. And yet, in that split second, Isaiah made a choice. He tapped into every bit of knowledge, every sharp observation he had honed in years of being underestimated. He memorized the pattern, traced the critical sign, and grabbed the communication device he wasn't supposed to have. "Emily, look at the right monitor." His voice cracked through the system, shaky but insistent. Emily froze mid-action. Her head snapped toward the monitor Isaiah had indicated. Her heart sank as her eyes registered the overlooked detail, a warning sign, subtle but undeniable. It was tiny, almost invisible, but it screamed danger. She felt a rush of adrenaline and disbelief. How had everyone missed it? The weight of the mistake, the near tragedy, pressed on her chest, but there was no time to dwell. Dr. Lauren's team hesitated, questioning Emily's sudden command. But Emily, fueled by sheer determination, ignored their skepticism. She adjusted the treatment, signaling the nurses with sharp, precise orders. The room seemed to move in slow motion. Every beep of the monitor, every second of hesitation, became monumental. Isaiah's eyes never left the screen, sweat forming on his brow. He knew he was risking everything by intervening, but he couldn't stay silent. Society had labeled him invisible, unworthy, but in that moment, his insight could tip the scales. His heart pounded as Emily acted. Minutes stretched like hours. Emily's hands flew over equipment, every decision critical, every instruction a battle against time and human error. Slowly, painfully, the monitors stabilized. The alarms quieted. Emily sank to her knees, trembling with relief, exhaustion, and disbelief. She had been saved, not just by her own skill, but by someone society had already written off. Silence hung heavy in the room. The gravity of what had just happened pressed on everyone present. Dr. Lauren looked at Emily with a mix of awe and confusion, realizing for the first time the critical role Isaiah had played. Emily's gaze turned to the security camera feed, and she saw Isaiah's face, his intense focus, his courage, his humanity staring back at her. A flood of emotions swept through her. Gratitude, shock, a bitter understanding of how easily prejudice could blind even the most capable people. But there was no time for comfort. Questions loomed larger than relief. How had something so simple been missed? How many others had been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated because of bias? And now, knowing the truth, could the system ever truly recognize the worth of someone like Isaiah? As Emily struggled to her feet, the room still tense, she whispered, almost to herself, "He saved me." A man no one believed could make a difference. And in that moment, the camera lingered on Isaiah's face, a mixture of pride and quiet defiance. His world, the one filled with chains and judgment, had intersected with hers in a way that would change both of them forever. But outside, the shadows of society's prejudice still waited, ready to test the courage they had just discovered. The chaos of the emergency room had passed, but the impact of that day rippled far beyond the walls of the hospital. Emily sat quietly in her car after her shift. The city lights blurred behind her, and she replayed every second in her mind. The fear, the helplessness, the knowledge that her life had teetered on the edge, it all came rushing back. She had always known her job carried risk, but risk compounded by oversight, negligence, or prejudice was an entirely different weight to bear. Isaiah returned to his cell later that evening, exhausted but quietly proud. The other prisoners noticed a subtle shift in him. Not arrogance, but a calm confidence that came from doing something that mattered. For once, the system that had tried to define his worth could not contain the truth. He had saved a life. The small acts of courage, the sharp observation, the refusal to stay silent, these were the things that truly mattered. In the hospital, Dr. Lauren had begun questioning more than just medical protocols. She reviewed the events that had nearly cost Emily her life, and saw the influence of subtle bias in every overlooked detail. The decisions made in the chaos weren't due to incompetence. They were shaped by assumptions about whose voice mattered, whose intuition deserved trust. For Lauren, it was a painful but necessary awakening. She began implementing changes immediately, making the emergency room more attentive to input from every team member, regardless of title, background, or societal assumptions. Emily and Isaiah's story didn't end with that single event. News of the incident spread quietly at first, then louder. Among staff and colleagues, whispers turned into discussions. Conversations about systemic prejudice, implicit bias, and the value of every human life started surfacing. Emily, who had once felt isolated and frustrated by the subtle dismissals she faced, found herself advocating for change, not just in procedure, but in perspective. Her voice, once drowned by doubt and assumption, now carried authority and moral weight. Isaiah, too, saw shifts. Guards who had once dismissed him as trouble began noticing the precision and care in his observations. Fellow inmates began to look at him differently, not as a symbol of what society feared, but as someone who could act decisively, who had courage that transcended bars and labels. Though he remained in prison, his world expanded in ways that no chain or wall could contain. He had become, in the eyes of some, a symbol of quiet heroism and the power of integrity. But the impact went deeper than recognition. Emily and Isaiah each carried a renewed sense of humanity. For Emily, the experience was a brutal reminder that bias, no matter how subtle, can cost lives. She committed herself to confronting it wherever it appeared, in the precinct, on the street, in herself. For Isaiah, it was proof that courage and careful observation could pierce the veil of prejudice. He learned that society's labels did not define him. His actions did. Communities around them began to notice, too. Emily spoke at local forums, addressing not only the dangers faced by law enforcement, but also the subtle ways racism and assumptions could create life-threatening situations. Isaiah, through sanctioned communication programs, shared his perspective with students and young adults, emphasizing awareness, empathy, and the courage to speak up. People began to understand the harsh reality. When prejudice rules, lives are endangered, and when unity prevails, lives are saved. The city, though imperfect, took small steps toward healing. Policies changed, training programs were updated, and a culture of listening began to take root. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't flawless, but it was a start. Emily and Isaiah became unlikely symbols of that change. One, a law enforcement officer whose life had been nearly lost to oversight. The other, a man judged by society yet capable of extraordinary insight and courage. Together, their story became a quiet but powerful testament to what can happen when people act not according to prejudice, but according to conscience and courage. Emily often reflected on the day she almost died. She thought about the weight of bias, the subtle judgments that had slowed critical decisions, and the bravery of a man whom the world had overlooked. Every time she revisited that memory, she felt a mix of gratitude and sorrow. The sorrow for all the times others might not be so fortunate, and the gratitude that Isaiah had acted when no one else could. Isaiah, sitting alone in his cell, sometimes stared at the ceiling and wondered about the fragility of life and the fragility of fairness. He understood better than most how prejudice distorts reality, how assumptions can blind even the skilled, and how courage, even from the most unlikely sources, can make a difference. He knew the world outside still carried injustice, but he also knew that his action had planted a seed that could grow into awareness, empathy, and change. The moral of their story was simple yet profound. Racism and prejudice are not just abstract wrongs. They destroy lives, weaken communities, and create unnecessary suffering. But courage, vigilance, and the willingness to act against injustice, even when it seems impossible, can heal, unite, and transform. When people like Emily and Isaiah refuse to accept the limitations imposed by bias, they not only save lives, they challenge the very system that allows hatred and discrimination to persist. In the months that followed, Emily and Isaiah maintained a silent, unspoken bond. They never met in person, but the knowledge of each other's courage resonated. Emily continued to advocate for systemic awareness, her decisions now informed by the sharp truth that life often depends on seeing beyond labels. Isaiah used his voice where he could, teaching that courage is not defined by freedom, nor is wisdom limited by status. Their story spread quietly through the city, in classrooms, at community centers, in hospital corridors. People who had once ignored subtle injustices now paused to consider them. Families began to talk, colleagues began to listen, and communities started to understand that every individual, regardless of background, holds the power to make a difference. And finally, Emily understood that the life she had almost lost had given her something unexpected: clarity. She had seen firsthand how prejudice could blind even the most capable, and how courage from an unlikely source could illuminate the path to justice. Isaiah understood the same truth from the other side. The world may judge you, underestimate you or ignore you, but courage, action, and integrity speak louder than assumptions. Together, in a story that could have ended in tragedy, they proved something timeless. Unity and courage defeat hate. Prejudice destroys, but awareness and action heal. And even in a world filled with bias, one courageous act can change everything. As the sun rose over the city, Emily walked her usual beat, alert, determined, aware of the fragility of life and the weight of justice. Somewhere, Isaiah observed quietly, knowing that one moment, one decision, had reshaped both their worlds. Their lives, forever intertwined by courage and conscience, carried a single, unshakable truth. Hate may linger, but courage, undaunted, precise, and human, always finds a way.